Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's stream. Thank you all for joining. As you know, my name is Ariana. I am the co-director of the Consent Academy. We're a Seattle-based nonprofit that aims to promote consent culture in every aspect of everyday life, from the bedroom to the boardroom. And I'm joined here today with a very exciting guest, Dr. Olsen. Would you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Loren Olsen. I'm a psychiatrist. I've been practicing psychiatry for almost 50 years now. I'm 79 years old. I'm gay. I was married previously to my wife and have two kids, six grandkids. Actually, my daughter is a psychiatrist in Seattle.
Oh, cool. Is a psychiatrist in Seattle and six grandkids. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I wrote a book or two. My most recent one is No More Neckties. The one I wrote before that was finally out, and it was about coming out in midlife because I obviously was married for 18 years and was trying to figure out what it was like to come out at that point because it's different process for men and women who have families and have to break up the family unit to come out. So and I've been married and with my partner Doug for 35 years now.
Yeah, I congrats on such a long and healthy relationship. I think 35 years is a achievement. Um,
Yeah.
but you mentioned the sort of difficulty of coming out when you're already sort of married and have a family and the difficulty there. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think, one of the misunderstandings that a lot of people have is what the pain of being caught in that situation. Many of us, for a variety of different reasons, it can be based on where you live geographically. It can be based on what morals you were taught as a kid. It can be all sorts of different things that cause you to follow the traditional life and ignore a lot of the clues that you might be same-sex attracted. And there's a similar pattern for a lot of us who have gotten married and had kids, and many of us were people who tried to meet everybody's expectations, and were always good boys or girls, and then married in good faith and had children, and then really felt strongly committed to the family unit and those and leaving your kids is extremely difficult. I think, whether you're gay or straight, the person who leaves is going to have a relationship with children which has changed. And so many of these men that I have contact with about this issue have been suicidal. Many of them have attempted suicide. And I think one of the keys in all that, Ariana, is that the when any of us are caught in a situation that is a predicament where there's no good choice, there's only bad choice and worse choices. That's when we begin to feel kind of hopeless. And when the hopelessness sets in, that's when suicide sometimes begins to look like a rational choice.
Yeah, I think about for example, the It Gets Better project. Like that really started to come out when I was in high school. And for me, like I'm bisexual, I kind of always knew because I kind of always was just the idea of just thinking only one kind of person was attractive. I was just like, I guess, and then I had a bunch of issues in middle school with like bullying. I had a group of female friends and they all kind of figured out before I did really that I was attracted to girls, and they then thought that I was like predatory, and they started accusing me of things that I would never
Oh,
do because they just assumed that that meant that I was like creepy and dangerous.
oh
And
yes.
that really kind of threw me for a loop in one sense, but I also kind of understood like they just don't know in this
Mhm.
other sense. And I remember when the sort of whole It Gets Better movement started happening, that was really nice for me because I was just like, yeah, this seems really stressful now because I'm in a small town and I'm like one of the only people that is kind of openly queer, and I'm not sure what to do about this. And then just being told again and again and again, hey, there is life after these situations, and it can get better. And that just being really good. But I imagine, especially for you growing up in the 50s, it was quite different. Yeah.
Yeah, considerably different. I didn't even know anyone who was openly gay until I was in my 30s. There, we had called kids sissy and stuff. Didn't even use the word queer when I was a kid all that much, but sissy was the big thing that you ran from. But all the way through my medical school and even my residency, we were diagnosable as pathologic deviants. And it was during, I think, 1973 or 4, when the diagnosis of homosexuality was removed from the diagnostic manual. And suddenly, with a stroke of a pen, we were cured of our mental illness, and suddenly became normal, at least for some people, not for everybody.
Yeah, I think about just, we were talking a little bit before we started streaming about psychology and psychiatry, and while I love those fields, the diagnostical and statistical manual is always like kind of filled with problems. Like it really it reflects the sort of state of the mindset towards science. To me, it's like a
Yeah.
philosophy of science text as much as it is as a diagnostic tool. And I still think about how, like, even today, there's issues with treatment of people who are trans, with getting, medical care, needing to be seen as having gender dysphoria, and they need to have these certain kind of presentations of, you know, like a pathology of this versus just like, no, I know what I want. This is who I am. This is better for me. And I think that just treating it inherently as these kind of disorders creates also a different lived experience for the people who recognize themselves in whatever name we're calling
Mhm.
something. What do you think about that?
Well, from my perspective, the manual is helpful. It sort of evolves over time, but a lot of it is to be able to testify. It's a lot of it, and to also meet the definition for your insurance companies. Those are the medical economic things that dictate a lot of what has to be defined in that kind of a way, and why some things are or not paid for. And that drives it a lot. But it does also help us establish some continuity when we talk to other people professionally, to have some understanding. And but like anything, I mean, it's like our Bible. If it depends on how you interpret it, and to know whether it's going to work for you. And so I understand what you're saying, but it does have a tendency, I think, to pathologize. But the bottom line in all that is it a disorder? It's only a disorder if it really significantly impacts the way you live your life. If you're able to go on and function and work and in your relationships and so on, then it's not a disorder. It might be troublesome. It might be a problem you need to deal with, but it's not labelable as a disorder.
Yeah, I think about that with things even like a lot of people have said, oh, ADHD, for example, isn't really real. It's a product of the capitalist society that we live in. And I'm like, the way we've set up society certainly makes it harder, but like it's definitely still real. And like if I were out in the woods all the time, I would still have issues.
Yeah.
I'd get
Yeah.
distracted by things. I would trip over something. Like it's not like a thing that's only exists because of the structure.
Yeah, you
Um,
couldn't decide which tree to pee behind.
Somebody in the chat asked that they're curious about the conversations in the psychiatry spaces that led up to the diagnosis being changed. Do you know much about like why it stopped being viewed as a disorder and like
Which one?
just homosexuality, like homosexuality no longer being
Well, actually, what happened, and I think there was a lot more to it than this, but the event which is talked about most is when Dr. Anonymous appeared in front of a committee, and this is actually 50 years ago, right now. And this was a psychiatrist who testified in front of the hearing committee of the American Psychiatric Association. But he testified wearing a mask and a wig, and he had his voice modulated so that he couldn't be identified. And then he said, "I'm a psychiatrist and I'm gay," and it was kind of the thing that moved the definition out of the diagnostic manual. And I think, part of it also was the change in psychiatry, because the psychoanalytic tradition was very much opposed to normalizing homosexuality. And as they maybe lost their influence in the organization, that allowed for some of it. But it was 50 years ago when that happened, and I was already practicing psychiatry before I could have said anything about it. Up to that point, I mean, even if I had been called gay in med school, I would have been asked to leave. If I had, I was in the military for 4 years as a flight surgeon. If I had been identified as gay, then I would have been dishonorably discharged. And when I was in my residency, actually, during my residency, I had my first man-on-man sex, and I was seeing a therapist at the time, and I had to confess it to him, and he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know how to handle it at all, and he had been very effective about so many other issues, but I think it really produced a conflict for him, and I wouldn't say that I got it resolved yet at that point, that I was comfortable with my sexuality. I kind of went back in the closet for several years after that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. At all these different stages, there's just different risks. So then, when you were getting divorced from your wife, you said that you sort of lost, your children. Was that part of the court's decision? Did the court know that you were gay, and that factored into all of this, or how did that kind of go down?
Actually, I've been really pretty blessed in that, because, for one thing, uh, uh, my wife and I were able to negotiate most of our issues out before the divorce was finalized. And she never tried to keep my kids away from me, even though she knew that I was gay. And so many other people have a different experience and all that. But it wasn't really that I lost them in the sense of I was kept from them, as much as just when you have kids that are teenagers or just preteens, as mine were at the time, it's those, you only have brief times when you can interact. It's that orange juice at the refrigerator in the morning as you're kicking them out the door to go to school, or picking them up after dance class, and you have those conversations in the car. And those were the things that I really missed. That kind of spontaneous interaction with them, because I've been very much a hands-on father up until that time. And so I also would say that my fears of the consequences of the damage to my relationship were much greater than what actually happened. I really didn't know what the court would say, and my attorney told me she wasn't sure either. But because my wife and I were able to slow the process down, and not have to go through a judge who could decide, it made it a lot easier. And I really think mediation is important for most couples, if they can do it. And if they're not ready to mediate, they're probably not ready for a divorce.
Yeah, I think about with mediation, a lot of people think that it's there to sort of solve the problem, but a lot of the time it's like people who are ready to come to an agreement and need help working things out.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I think that's it. You have to be resolved to the idea that the marriage is over before you can get to that point. But working out your anger through the court is not a good idea.
So then, I'm curious because my parents got divorced. They separated when I was about 9, and the divorce was finalized a few years later. And I remember at the time they were incredibly worried that I was going to become an angry kid. They really put me into therapy even before they told me that they were separating because they were so worried about this. My reaction was, cool. I get 2 Christmases and 2 birthdays and 2 bedrooms today. I've always been very like positive mental attitude kind of person.
Not everybody sees it that way. I think, the hardest part for me was when I was, I mean, it was all tied to my coming out as well, but I moved into an apartment that had very little in it because I didn't have anything. And so when I have 2 daughters, and when they would come, it wasn't a place where they felt at home at all, and that was really hard. And I think a lot of times when you're the non-custodial parent, I hate that label, but that's what it means, and you feel like you have to compensate for that by making, taking them to the circus and to the ice capades and everything else instead of just hanging out and doing normal things. And some of the best times were one was picking apples, where we just had a lot of laughs and a lot of fun, and those kinds of things were much better than when I tried to entertain them and prove that I was still invested in their lives. But
Yeah, I definitely saw that with my own parents. And yeah, my parents, even after separating, the bickering and anger and fighting didn't go away for a long time. And
yes.
as a kid, that was actually useful for me because I was like, oh, this is how things can go wrong. Here's the stuff, what I want to work on in myself so it doesn't happen. But, I was reading some of your thoughts about your book, No More Neckties, the one that just came out on the
Yes.
17th, specifically talking about how this is not necessarily about the coming out, it's about the learning to want to really live as yourself and not feel like you have to win anybody's approval. And is that something that you felt like after your divorce in relationship to your kids? Like, did you really want them to approve of you and accept
Yeah,
you?
I mean, I lost my father very young, Ariana. I was only 3, and so I had this idea that I had to be the best uh, father I could be to my kids. And in the process, I was kind of reparenting myself, by doing that. And so my expectations of what a good father was were way too high. And so I, at one point, had to decide that I was good enough. I wasn't going to be perfect. And that took a lot of pressure off. I knew what I had, that I had certain responsibilities. I was committed to meeting those responsibilities, but I didn't have to be perfect. I feel, but a lot of people get addicted to approval. They want approval, and they get it, and then it doesn't last long, and so they have to go get another hit and another hit and another hit, and in the process, they've delegated responsibility for their life to other people. As we were talking before, my mother didn't want me to be a psychiatrist, and a lot of times I look back on that and think, yeah, that was really when I said, Mom, I'm in charge of my life. I know you're not going to like this. And, a lot of times when we do that, people come along with us when they see that we're happy about the decision we made and we feel comfortable with it. And the same with coming out. She didn't understand why I would want to do that. But she accepted me and Doug without difficulty, although she never really understood it. And she was a strong Christian woman and had some conflict around that. But as far as, I never felt I lost her love uh, as I feared maybe I would when I first came out.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. When I was a kid, the first time I wanted to come out to my dad as bisexual, there was definitely like he he had had a lot of, so I have an aunt on my mom's side who's a lesbian. So like there was always some amount of acceptance because we all knew I had an aunt who was a lesbian. But my dad definitely, one of the other things was my first boyfriend was bisexual, and he liked to come to school and then change into like a dress and high heels and paint his nails, and then he'd undo all of that before he went home. And my dad really did not like that I was dating that person. Uh, and he also at the time really felt he had just had a lot of homophobia, and he was really afraid of things like STDs and felt like it was mostly gay and lesbian people who were responsible for that. He thought bisexuals especially were like dangerous because they were like riskier. So I didn't end up coming out to him for a very long time. But then when he got remarried, it was actually his gay best friend who like officiated their wedding. And I just remember at that time being like, so much change can happen in one lifetime.
Some of it good, some of it not. Yeah, I've lived long enough to see a lot of changes in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just fascinating though how like you can yes, there are definitely people who like say reject their kids when their kids come out, and I think that that's really really difficult and incredibly traumatic and can cause a lot of harm. And I think that even people who seem like very staunchly homophobic or phobic against whatever is the
Yeah.
situation, there is also can be hope and there can be change. And not always, but I think that that's part of the other thing of like for me, I remember as a kid thinking at that time like, well, even if my parents don't approve, I can't change who I am. And so I want to like myself. I want to accept myself. I don't want to have this hinge on whether or not my parents accept this sort of thing. Because like there are plenty
Yeah.
of things my parents don't accept that are ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah, and you know that's when we finally feel like we're adults, isn't it? When we realize that we have to do this, whatever it is that we need to do, and say fuck off to other people. I don't care what you think. And as you get older, that becomes easier too. But you were talking about how difficult it is for teens, and people say that it's a lot easier.
One second. Okay. Can you all hear me still? One second. Okay, you can still hear me. Good. Yeah, I think it was, yeah, the video is all silly now. I think his internet cut. So hopefully he'll join us just again in a second. Thank you all for sticking with me. Um, you're still muted.
I lost my internet connection for a minute there. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Uh, I was talking about how at this bookstore, this woman, she was an older woman, was carrying my book around, and I asked her to come and join us because I could tell she was kind of trying to eavesdrop on the conversation we were having. And after I was done, she raised her hand and she said, "I have to tell you a story about what happened." And she said, "My grandson came to me a week ago and told me he was gay, and I said it really didn't matter. I'd still love him." And then she said he went home and told my son, who was his father, and his father said, "I won't have a gay son." And the son went out and shot himself. And and that still happens. And the number of people who attempt or are successful at suicide is not getting any better, really, in a lot of ways. And since I'm interested in more mature men in my work, we don't know how many mature men and women are caught in that same situation, and because of the pain of not being able to figure out what to do, uh, they attempt suicide or are successful. And one of the main goals in writing this book, and it, as I mentioned to you, it's pretty intensely personal in some ways, but the motivation for doing it was to try and give somebody hope. It gets better for us too. Not, it's not just a message for teens who are trying to come out, but it can get better even as very older men who come out. I see sometimes I hear stories of men who've been married 30 or 40 years who lose their spouse and decide to come out at that point. I mean, it's never too late to make those kinds of changes in your life if you really need to be the person you were meant to be.
Yeah, I think about I've had some friends who are sort of like queer elders and heard a lot of like kids these days kind of rhetoric. And one, I agree with you. I think we often forget about like it's not just about kids, but also
Yeah.
the idea of the survivorship biases that can also happen, where
Yes.
like you don't know how many people, for example, just never came out of the closet. And
Yeah.
even to themselves, which, as I understand it, is what it used to mean is like the first time you come out to yourself.
Yeah. Exactly.
And a lot of people never ever go there. And it's the same with like, I get kind of sad when I hear all of the jokes about assuming that homophobic politicians are all secretly gay, because I'm like, I mean, yes, this happens, and that often represents tremendous self hatred and pain. And it's
Yeah.
really tragic.
Yeah, I think we're gay when we say that we're gay, or we're bisexual when we finally decide that's what we are. And the ways that other people label us are based on stereotypes and misunderstandings, and we really have to figure out who we are and frankly what we like to do sexually before we can have a clear understanding of who we are as a person. So in some ways, the labels can be helpful, but they can also be very destructive when applied inappropriately by other people. But all of us, I think, want to have some, and that's why there's like 116 different labels for our sexuality, because everybody wants to. But what we're struggling with is trying to figure out ourselves what it is that we like, and there are so many ways. And basically, I like the word queer because it's such a good explanation. You don't have to define it any further than that, just in order to say you have an alternative. I have a grandson in Seattle. He was when he had just finished the sex education courses in Seattle, and he said, "Grandpa, what's the G in LGBT mean?" And or the Q? No, he said the Q. What's a Q in LGBTQ? He said some kids say it means queer, but other kids don't like that word very much. What does it mean? So we had a very nice He had some really good sex education there in Seattle, and even though he was 10 years old, we were able to have a pretty mature discussion about sexuality and why I like the word queer.
Yeah, I think that I like your idea of like we are whatever it is we say we are. And I definitely agree with that. I don't like when we out other people or when we put labels on them that are not necessarily, they don't reflect reality. I have a small issue with the idea of the ways in which, say, this monkeypox outbreak, they're focusing on it being around, sexual transmission and saying, oh, it's gay men or bisexual men. But the one bit I do like is that they include also men who have sex with men because it's
Yeah,
like,
yeah. Yeah, yeah, and in fact, that would be my favorite word, because it's very clear by that definition of behavior. It's not a definition of psychology. You either have had sex with a man or you haven't. That's very clear, and so the CDC uses that, and it's a very helpful concept. In one study, there were a large study in New York City area of working class men. They found that 10% of the married men had had sex with a man within the last year, and 10% of those who identified as homosexual or heterosexual were actually having sex exclusively with men. So, when you define the research based on what your behavior is, it makes it a lot easier to understand the concept. Because there are a lot of men who have, and women, I'm sure. I work mostly with men. I don't mean to discount women at all, but there are a lot of men who would never define themselves as gay or homosexual or anything, but or bisexual. Sometimes that's a little softer landing for some people, and they might come that far. But there are a lot of people who are exploring their sexuality. And when McKinsey did his work in the 40s, it was like, you're a homosexual or you're heterosexual, 100% one or the other. You could fall on that spectrum somewhere, but I think sexuality is more like a matrix with, hundreds of variations. And we're each individual in the ways that we want to express ourselves sexually.
Yeah, I really like that as well. And I like it also is one of the reasons why I also like queer because it's like, you know, there's so many aspects of any of us that change and evolve over time, depend on context, depend on like who we're with, right? Like I've known people who are say like I fell in love with someone and they happened to be of the same
Yeah,
sex as me, and other people being like, no, I fell in love with them because of this, and both
yeah,
are true statements.
yeah.
And I think that you know that also is kind of part of this, I think, push for people to be able to be proud of who they are and to be accepting of who they are, to be able to come up with either incredibly nuanced labels and definitions, or just be like, I don't know, it's this a vibe of queerness.
Yeah, one of the things that could I ask you a question? And that is one of the things that came to my mind this morning was I was thinking about the concept of consent, and I have a perception. I don't have any facts or anything to support it, but I have an idea that maybe through the dating apps that at least gay men are better in negotiating what's going to be allowed before they meet someone. They'll, are you bottom, are you top? What do you like? What do you not like? A lot of that stuff can be negotiated up front, but I don't know if that's true or not. And, you're a woman, you're in a different age group than I am, and have had different kinds of experience. I'd be curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I have been on dating apps that are for like women looking for women. I've been on dating apps that's on apps that are not specifically for lesbians. I would not put that I was bisexual because then I just tended to get a lot of straight guys who are like, "Will you have sex with me and my girlfriend?" And I would just like, "No."
Yeah.
But I have had a lot of friends talk about, and I've had dates where there was the issue of like, we're gonna go and have sex, and then we both realize we're bottoms, and we're like, "Oh no."
Yeah.
So I think that there's some of that for sure. For me, it's also hard because I'm also part of the kink community and I have worked as a dominatrix before. For me, it was like a very therapeutic thing of like embracing power and thinking about being in charge in these situations, growing up in a space where I didn't have a lot of autonomy. And for that, it was always like everything is negotiated ahead of time. I don't
Uh-huh.
renegotiate during a scene. And that carried over a lot into a lot of my sex life.
Uh-huh.
Because as a dominatrix, it was very like non-sexual, at least in my practice. But then in my dating life, yeah, things for the most part were pretty negotiated. But I would say that it depends on the app. I think with sort of as a woman, if I'm looking for, or if I was looking for a guy, it would be tough because if I were that explicit, there would then be this assumption, well, then we are definitely going to have sex, and then
Oh,
and
yeah. I hadn't thought about that.
yeah, and so
Yeah,
a lot of the time for me too, it's like I'm not sure. I won't know until I like meet you and get the vibe of if we're gonna do this or not. Like I've had one
yeah.
night stands with complete strangers walking down the street being like, "Hey, you're very attractive. Would you like to have
Yeah.
sex with me?"
Yeah. I think it may be, and this may be too much of a generalization too. I think that women are perhaps more inclined to want to have a vibe first before they negotiate sex than men are. I don't know that that's necessarily true. And obviously, when you make a statement like that, you're always wrong some of the time. But I think uh, generally speaking, in my experience with men and dating apps, that most of them do know that there's going to be sex when they agree to meet. I mean, that's just the way it is. And it, but I did talk to a group of men and ask them, have you ever been caught in a situation where you felt comfortable saying no? And most of them didn't think. I think there's difference though when there's a difference in power in the relationship, and people do consent to things if they don't want to, if they feel that they're in a weaker position.
Yeah, for sure. I think that my assumption as well is that like when it comes to women or anybody who's femme or uh, assigned female at birth, sort of the feminine sort of side of things, there is some more wanting to get a vibe before wanting to be, say, alone with a person because of
Yeah.
power differentials. But I also know lots and lots and lots of exceptions to this. For me, it's like it is often about a vibe. But it also has depended on what was going on in my life at the time. Like when I was having those one night stands, I had just gotten divorced, and I was like,
Yeah.
I want to put some bodies between me and this person.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. I think, one of the things I talk about to groups of older men is that I think older men, and there were actually a couple lesbians at my talk yesterday, and they said it was the same for them. But older people maybe are better lovers in some way because we are more sensitive to what the other person's needs are and what they want. And for when you're a young man, you think sex is all about getting an erection, inserting it somewhere, ejaculating, and then repeating. And that's really kind of the whole process of sex when you're a young man. I don't know what it would be like for women in that regard, but as you mature, in many cases, that process slows down in a lot of ways, and you're kind of freed from the tyranny of testosterone maybe, and you can begin to slow down the process and enjoy lovemaking in a much broader context, and even men without being able to ejaculate can have good sex, but that is the ultimate definition for most young men about whether or not you've been successful. I suppose it's like the same as whether or not you can bring your partner to orgasm. That's also another a hallmark of being successful.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I've had a lot of discussions with friends about how like some of the better lovers that we've had are people who say didn't sort of start having sex until college or later because they tended to be more receptive to getting feedback and things like that and had fewer bad habits. But then I also think about like for myself, I had like, you know, lots of kissing and touching and other things, but in terms of like sex with women
Yeah.
until I was in college and actually towards the end of college because I had so much performance anxiety. I was just like, I don't know if I'll be good at this. And like lesbian porn is giving me no information.
Yeah, not a good place to learn. I laugh at the word of performance because one of the things I talk about too is that I hate the word sexual performance because it's like you're expecting applause or something after you're done, it should be about sexual pleasure. That's what our definition of what lovemaking should be is, are we being pleased ourselves, but are we also giving our partner pleasure of the kind that they want? That's in my mind, that's the goal that I want in my relationships. I would hope that others would want the same thing, but maybe that's up to them.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. We've had other streams where it's my co-director and we talk a lot about pornography and consent and ethics and
Yeah.
just stuff in general. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot is that we miss vintage porn because it had more humor and playfulness in it versus a lot of contemporary stuff is much more hardcore and much more sort of chasing the extremes to get more clicks and that kind of stuff. But uh, that humor and silliness and all of that is its own kind of special intimacy. And in sexual spaces, it can be incredibly pleasant to just kind of be silly with each other and playful.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like you say, it's like because of the merchandising of it, it has to be more and more extreme. And yeah, well, what's the next step? And there's not a lot of seduction or romance or anything else. When they move right away to the point of view experience of sex. Uh, and there's a lot of sexual pleasure, Ariana, comes from anticipating it. If you look at the model for dopamine as being kind of the pleasure molecule in the brain, that's secreted in anticipation of sex, not during sex. And so a lot of the pleasure is in the chase, and the dopamine drops off significantly after the sexual experience. But a lot of the pleasure comes from in the cruising, the search, um, uh, uh, and frankly, if you move right away to very explicit sex, you don't have that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's fascinating and it absolutely makes sense. Um, and so one of the other things that I've seen you talk about that is really interesting to me is things like body shame. And I have a lot of friends of mine who are gay and they talk about how on dating apps it'll say things like no fats, no femmes, no Asians. I mean, it's all kinds
Yeah.
of problems in that.
uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, I grew up with tits, and I didn't like them. I think, a lot of that was based in the idea that I wasn't a total man because I had breasts, and they weren't really huge, but it was like evidence. And when I talk about this, other men are shaking their heads. A lot of people have felt the same thing, and I know, that in the experience I've had with trans people, woman to man kind of transition, most of them want to have their breasts removed first. I mean, the rest of it is not as important, but it's really urgent for most trans women or transitioning to man to get rid of the breast. And I know I felt exactly the same way. But I had an experience when I was about 50, I think, when a younger man met me on the sidewalk at a gay resort, and I had my suit on, but he put his finger here and slid it down to me dick, and he said delicious, and I was like, are you seeing what I see? And the fact was he didn't see me as I see myself. He saw me. A lot of younger men who like older men like somebody with a hairy chest and a big belly, and that's what turns them on. And it's one of those experiences that said, hey, maybe I need to take another look at myself and know I may not be attracted to me, but there are people who are, and that's the bottom line in all that is, we need to feel that our attractiveness isn't uh, based on some unachievable standard, and even at the gym, you see these guys who are massively muscled and well built with V-shaped bodies, and they're complaining about the half inch of fat on their thigh or something, you know, and I think most of us aren't 100% satisfied, and I think to go back to there's I think the cosmetic industry is like $50 billion a year, and plastic surgery is like $20 billion a year, and uh, people get repeated procedures and buy all this stuff. They think that it's going to change, and I think that their marketing is designed to make us uncomfortable with our bodies, not saying a promise that this is what you can become, but this is who you shouldn't be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's so much pressure. And I lived in Japan for a really long time, and uh, dating in Japan, especially dating women in Japan, had really interesting kind of complications because one, like thinness is incredibly prized. Like for an American, I'm considered pretty thin, but in a lot of the rest of the world, I'm not, especially Japan, where people are very, very, very thin. And there was a lot of pressure to be thinner.
Uh-huh.
But even the women who were very thin really struggled with body image issues. And I saw eating disorders be, I think, more in the lesbian community than I think they were in a lot of the rest of it, because there was like the double awareness of like, I know what it's the expectations that are on me. And I also know like what is going to be seen as attractive. And I know all of, and it was really, really difficult in that sense. And I think that there's also related to the sort of focus on a certain type of look, there's also ageism, and just ageism
Yeah.
in spaces of romance and dating, and also who's even allowed to be seen in public and whose bodies are allowed to be seen in public.
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah. One of the things I've discovered is that there are a lot of young men who like older men, which has sort of been refreshing to get hit on as an old man when you think that your sex life is over or your attractiveness is over for sure. But what you're saying about body image is really true. That and it's so common in eating disorders, and I'll use the word disorder. Intentionally, but what you see it very profoundly with an eating disorder, that they have a really distorted sense of what their body looks like, and if they were to draw their outline on a piece of paper, what they look like, it would be much different than what they actually look like, and I think all of us suffer from that in some way, that we don't see ourselves, because all we do is we focus on the negative, the parts. I mean, my focus on my breast, it was like that became the focus of my dissatisfaction, not only with my body but with myself, and we interpreted it internally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's not very hard, but also very not surprising, which is that you can get really fixated on one thing and feel like if this thing were different, then everything else would be different. And I
Yeah,
think that especially happens when there are other aspects of our lives that are causing us pain, but that
yeah,
we can't really do anything about. And
yeah.
it's very difficult. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that. I had one young guy who'd had 7 nose jobs. I mean, he really had dysphoric disorder, and even then, I don't know how uh, you could how could a plastic surgeon justify doing that? That seems to be unethical for the surgeon to have performed that many procedures on him, knowing that the result was going to be the same every time. He's going to be dissatisfied.
Yeah. I mean, I think, these whole industries really benefit from just people in these vulnerable positions and who are really, really
Yeah,
dissatisfied. Um,
yeah, yeah. yeah. I used to go when I was going to the gym more regularly when I was younger. You would see men run to the locker room and look at themselves in a mirror two or three times during a workout, to see if anything had changed. Results don't come that easily for us. No.
Yeah, yeah. And then one of the other things I've seen as like a theme, not not as so directly, but just sort of kind of pulled in a lot of different things, is both self-acceptance, but also sort of self-forgiveness.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
can
yeah.
you talk about your ideas of self-forgiveness?
Well, I think um, forgiveness is largely based on being able to empathize with another person. If we had a conflict and to reach forgiveness, I would have to come to some kind of empathy with you for what you were going through, and then and the same for you. But that happens with yourself, that internal conflict of when you have to be able to empathize with the other side of yourself, to know that and be able to forgive some of that behavior. For example, when I was first coming out, I was cheating on my wife. That was inconsistent with my values as a human being, and to be able to accept and forgive myself for all of that, I had to be able to understand some of the pain that I was in at the time and trying to figure out who I was. And I think it's really that sense of being able to remember what the pain felt like for why you made the choice that you made.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, empathy for ourselves. And I think that is also really important uh, for both the past and the future. Like, I often try to make sure that the way I think about myself now and the way I treat myself now also includes empathy for my future self, that I
Yeah,
try to take good care of myself, to respect myself, to respect, my life, my body, all of these things.
yeah,
And while that changes what that looks like, as I mentioned earlier, there was a time when respecting myself was having several one night stands because that was what was actually healthiest for me to do.
yeah.
And at this point in my life, that would not be this, it wouldn't be the same thing. Um,
Yeah,
and
yeah, I think it does evolve, and it should evolve over time. We're based on our experiences.
yeah. And then, I think about how you also just mentioned now, just infidelity. And I
Oh
think
yeah,
infidelity is one of those things that's so complicated because it's kind of always labeled as like the worst thing someone can do in a marriage. But then I think that if, for the most part, if you look at anyone's actual story, it's possible to empathize. Even someone who's just doing it because they're like the worst possible case, they're entitled and they don't care. Like that's its own kind of problem. Like they
yeah,
have,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I agree. And um, uh, I think Doug and I, when we got together, our relationship was based on monogamy, and we both failed at that. And I think it's easy to make a commitment to that when you're young and in love, and you're basically psychotic in your relationship, and you can't think rationally about what is going to happen. But then when you're in a long-term relationship, your sexual desires, your sexual opportunities, the barriers to sex, all those things change and evolve over time. And so it's my belief, Ariana, that infidelity occurs when the trust is broken, not when the sex happens. And it's if and that was definitely true in our relationship with Doug, because we had avoided talking about any of that hard stuff, and then it feels a lot more like cheating, and unless you have had some discussions about it. But I agree with what you're saying about that. That people always say once a cheater, always a cheater. I hate that idea because we're all human beings. We're all sexual human beings, and we're all vulnerable to failing at some of the standards we set up for ourselves. And I cheated, but I didn't see myself as the cheating kind, whatever that is. But there are people who don't have a lot of moral values and will can't make a commitment to anything. That's definitely true, but I'm not seeing myself in that same category. And I think a lot of people who fail to make uh, monogamous commitment are in that same category. I like Dan Savage's term, monogamish. You can be committed in a relationship, and you can have all the trust and love in a relationship that you want in a long-term relationship, but still have an occasional either spontaneous or whatever outside relationship without it destroying your primary commitment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, at least I've noticed in sort of younger circles, polyamory or just sort of consensual non-monogamy have been really common. My husband and I actually started out in an open relationship, and then we decided that monogamy was better for us because just it worked for our personalities. And I found for myself with ADHD that I had a hard enough time being like consistent with one person, that if I put other people in the mix, I just kind of was letting a bunch of people down at the same time. So it just worked better for me to be like, okay, because part of the problem for me is whatever's right in front of me is all that exists. And
uh,
that made it so that one, I needed somebody who was very like not jealous, very secure in their attachments, could handle the fact that like I'm not going to message them 50 times a day, every day, all the time.
yeah.
And that also means that like my ability to be very giving to a partner is not limited, but it exists in a particular type of form. And trying to do that with many people or even just a couple of people at the same time was difficult. And
Yeah.
but I think that we profited a lot from those early experiences. We also had 2 years of long distance, which was like basically being on different continents. Uh,
That's pretty long distance.
yeah, and because we met in Japan, and then I moved to France, and then he moved to Seattle for his PhD, and then so we were like hopping around. But that
Yeah.
ended up meaning that our relationship was also very very, very based on communication and trust. And we had to really make sure we were on the same page before we took any step forward because it was
Yeah.
going to be thousands of dollars in plane tickets. And
Yeah, that would be difficult to manage for most of us. I think my first real cheating was on an out of town vacation. It's like suddenly I moved to a different world. I could be the person I didn't have to be at home. It's so easy to cheat. It's very hard to keep a secret. So especially if you're in your hometown, and no matter how big or small it is, it could be a very small community. uh,
yeah, I also think that there's not even just, I mean, I think when people think cheating, we often think of just like having sex. But I think there's also sort of like emotional cheating that can happen a lot as
oh,
well.
absolutely.
I think that happens more than people even realize. Like, I think sometimes people talk about, oh, like my work spouse or something. And when people tell me more about it, I'm like, I feel like that's just me. But like, do you actually talk with your partner about these interactions that you're having with your like coworker, work spouse? Because, for me and my partner, we really talk through all of this. Like, like I said, we benefited a lot from our early polyamory sort of practice about being like
Uh,
very communication forward, very open. Like, if jealousy happens, we're right there with each other to kind of work through it. And like, we recognize that it comes from like a positive place of, I don't want to lose this thing that's important to me, etc. But I often just worry about like, are people being honest with themselves, and also are they being honest with each other? And I think that's also, this all kind of comes around to a similar issue of like being in a different kind of closet, like the closet of
yeah,
not wanting to talk about, say, not having your needs met in your
yeah,
relationship or being dissatisfied with the life that you've worked towards,
yeah,
and needing to be able to admit that to yourself.
yeah. Yeah, I think, loving someone really is about being as concerned about their welfare as your own. And we lose sight of that, I think, many times. But for some, and it was certainly true for me, but it's even hard to bring up the idea that in a relationship that you might want something more than what you're able to experience with your own partner. It can feel like that's threatening to the relationship, and so there has to be some discussion of hard stuff has to happen in all relationships, because it's going to happen. You're going to have hard stuff of one kind or another in any relationship, and you need to feel secure that you can bring up and talk about those things for the relationship to last.
Yeah, before my partner and I got married, we did a lot of that. We had this whole project of asking each other these different questions and getting really deep into things. And we played all of these like what if games for things that would never happen. I was like, what if I went to federal prison for drug trafficking? Would you want to stay together? We really talked through that, like what would that mean and like what would be the pain points there and like how, and obviously like if we were really in that situation it would probably be quite different, but it still gave us the opportunity to work through like what are the value systems there. And we also talked about practicals, like what do you think is a reasonable amount of money to spend on a pair of shoes or like a sofa? Do we have the same values about like
Yeah.
prioritization of resources? These are the things that they don't seem like sexy questions, and people
Well, they
often.
are, yeah, but they're important ones. Yeah, I'm surprised that you were able to do that. Uh, uh, but I mean, I think it's great that you were able to. I just, so many couples, when they fall in love, think they found the one and only that's going to satisfy every need in their life forever after. And that's so unrealistic. It's on so many levels. And there are all these things that come up that throw barriers. And a lot of times when you have uh, some people when they are disappointed about their needs not being met, they think it's a bad relationship, and they're ready to move on to go find the perfect person, and so they have these serial relationships over searching for that perfect person who's going to make them whole. Other people don't make us whole. We have to make ourselves whole ourselves.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that it's, I mean, for me, the ability to see the short-sightedness of this was one, looking at my own parents' marriage. They got married 18 and 19 years old. Like, I, when people later were like, "Are you upset that they got divorced?" And I'm like, No, I think it was the best thing for both of them. And they've gone and
Yeah,
lived full lives. And like, I want my parents to be happy people. And,
yeah,
but then also, just as having ADHD and experiencing what it's like to have a hyper fixation where like I became really fixated. Like there was one period of time where all I wanted to do was read about like jellyfish and I was like obsessed. And
yeah.
then when the hyper fixation passes, suddenly I'm like, yeah, whatever, jellyfish. And so recognizing that process and realizing, oh, this is really similar to the initial phase of dating where you're kind of like obsessed. This is all you can think about, is the only thing that feels satisfying, and being like, I don't know if it's always going to go that way, but I recognize that it could. So, like,
Yeah.
if I'm going to spend my life with somebody, we got to make sure that a lot of these other things line up too.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a very healthy. I think you should write a list once you're able to focus on it. Write a list of questions that couples should ask prior to making the commitment, saying yes to commitment.
Yeah, I mean, we did some very funny things. Like, well, one, yeah, at our wedding, we completely ad-libbed our wedding vows. Neither of us were prepared. He's not diagnosed with ADHD, but the likelihood is very high. But we were very earnest about what we said, and like some of the promises we made were also like genuinely slightly advice to the audience. But one of the things that we said was things like, "Oh, always be careful about like the regard that we have for each other. Like we'll be very
uh,
careful to not get into the thoughts of like, oh, I can't believe I'd be with someone who's this." And instead, always try to see each other as whole people. And then we would also like, one of the promises I made was like, I'll always be willing to admit when I'm just in a bad mood. And like, so our wedding vows were very much like, we're gonna just try to like really respect each other as human
Yeah.
beings. But the thing is like, I only really got to these points by having a bunch of bad relationships, by having to figure out who I was, figure out my sexuality, come to terms with different things, recognize the ways in which, like, I am very different, not just in terms of sexuality, but in just my brain and how it functions, and become really comfortable with who I am as a person.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And it's very hard when you're young to figure that out, how do you make a decision about who you are without having some world experience to see where you have succeeded and where you've failed and what's gone wrong and how you contributed to the ways it went wrong or what things went right. Um, uh, you have to live a little. And I guess at my age, I should have it all figured out, huh?
I mean, to me, it's kind of like my understanding is that life's kind of an adventure up until the very last moment.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree. People say, why at 79 you're still working and doing all this stuff? And it's like, it's what keeps me feeling like I have meaning in my life, And you talked about ageism a while back, and I had a tough time when I was going turning 60 because I thought that was sort of the turning point for entering the late life kind of time, and so I didn't like it very much, but I spoke to a group in Houston of gay men. And after I was done, this guy stood up and he said, I'm 82 and this is the best time in my life. And I thought, how the hell does he feel that? What does he know that I need to figure out? And uh, I really believe that our older years can be the best years in our life because we don't have to be driven by the same responsibilities and obligations that we have when we're much younger. And I think many of the happiest people are midlife and past. So don't be afraid of it wherever you are.
Yeah, I remember when I turned my 30s, I'm 35, have been so much better than my 20s because as soon as I turned 30, I was like, woohoo, the pressure to be cool is gone.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's right.
But I also just profit from all the mistakes I made in my 20s and how lost I felt and how much I kind of threw myself into different identities at different times and kind of figured it out. But I think that, I'm really excited to read your newest book because you've talked so much in the sort of write ups for it about the freedom of just really realizing the pleasure of being oneself. And
Yeah,
you also said this quote I really think is quite beautiful, which is, if I'm going to be known all over the world, I want to be known as myself. And that's really stuck with me because sometimes, I'm like a lot of people with ADHD, I'm not very good at always having a filter and I'm very much an open book. And every once in a while, I've had these worries about, oh, am I oversharing? Am I like, what I kind of overthink it. And then I realized this, I read this quote and it actually kind of has settled for me this like, wow, it's actually a relief because I agree with that. Like, I want to be known as who I really am, not just the sanitized, polished parts of myself.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That was the process of that I went through, and it was when I was writing the book. Was that I really uh, can I put this stuff out there? And I thought, yeah, I mean, I really have to. I hate hypocrisy. I didn't want to present myself as someone that I wasn't, and that included some of my mistakes, and some of them were big mistakes. And but I thought, yeah, I don't want to present myself as being the perfect man that I'm not, and that someone who has all the answers. I'm still figuring it out, and I expect I will continue that search for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really wonderful. And I think people, you talk about a lot of hard stuff in your work, and I think that's actually really important because so many of us struggle with so many things that we just think that we're the only ones. Like I think about
Yeah,
even just like medical things. We don't talk about that, or how many people I've known as they've gotten older feel just absolute mortification about needing help with things like toileting. And I'm like,
yeah,
that's normal. And like, I mean, as I mentioned to you before, I grew up in a sort of medical household and I very much profited from just anything medical being very default and not shameful. And,
yeah, yeah,
but I think that, I try to be very open also as a way of being like, other people are going to have had similar experiences. And I don't want them to think that they're alone. I don't want them to think that, oh, this like thing about me is just I'm uniquely bad or weird. Um, and I think everything in your books from talking about, loss and body image and infidelity and sex and aging, I think that's also really important. I hate the ways we just, you know, infantilize anyone
yeah.
over the age of 65.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I think those are all things that I think are so important. And and bottom line, again, in writing this was to talk to people and let them know that if they're having these fears, these experiences, this discomfort, they're not alone in it. You know that they're and that there are answers. We may not know what the answers are, but to just offer them a sense of hope that somehow they can get through it. And in particular, that suicide is never the right answer for that.
Yeah, for sure. And so this is the one question that I actually feel like I should have asked at the beginning, but didn't. What actually made you want to write your first memoir, especially? Like what made you decide, hey, I want to tell people about who I am?
Um, the first one was because I had researched the literature on what it was like for middle-aged people to come out, and there wasn't really much of anything. All the studies were done and talked about, your self-awareness developing during adolescence and progressing, and by the time you're 25, you should have it all figured out. That was kind of the stages of the coming out process. By 26, you ought to know. And it wasn't true for me, and so I wanted to see if it was a different process for people who came out at older, and so I did some research on that, and I found that it is different because it's more complicated because of the family connections and all of those things that go along with it. So that was kind of the motivation for writing it. I had never expected to write a book. I'd always written things, short essays, pieces for different publications and newsletters and stuff. And I thought, yeah, this story needs to be told because I know that I'm not alone in this. And that's how that first one came about. This current book, No More Neckties, came about primarily because of the COVID epidemic. I couldn't work. I couldn't do anything. I was stuck at home. I figured I have to do something, so I started writing it. The most difficult chapters I wrote about 10 or 12 years ago when I went through a very dark time in my relationship. But I couldn't publish them then because I wasn't secure about a relationship. I didn't know where things were headed. Now we've gotten through that, and I felt it was safe to talk about it. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. I think that's also a really important story to tell. I think I'm glad, for example, that divorce is legal and is the stigma around it is going down because there are many, many marriages that should not continue. Like me and my
yeah,
first marriage, that was just, we were married for less than a year. It was
yeah,
mostly for a visa at first, and then it was very clear very quickly we were not compatible, and we ended it.
yeah.
But I also think about my grandparents telling me that there were times where they didn't like even speak to each other for a year or more, but they loved each other. My grandfather passed, but my grandmother is still in love with him. Like she's had men, make overtures towards her, and she's just like, no, he's the only one for me. I was with him from the age of like
Yeah.
14. I don't want anybody else ever. And that's also possible that you can go through incredibly difficult times, incredibly just hard and dark things, and relationships can survive that as well. It can get better.
Yes,
So
yeah, it can. But it really can if you can't talk about the conflicts and the problems you have. So, um, well, I'm gonna need to go to the bathroom here. I'm an old man, Ariana,
yeah, yeah. It's been a real joy to talk with you.
Yeah, it has been. I enjoyed it. You were worried we couldn't fill an hour. We could have gone for another hour.
I'm sure, I'm sure. So, for everybody in the audience, here's a link to both the books and Dr. Olsen's website and his Twitter. I found him through the Twitter. What really attracted to me first was all the pictures of you sitting naked by the pool reading your own book. And I was just like, I love this.
Well, that worked then, didn't
It really did.
it?
I was like, yeah, I'm into this sort of like self love and self confidence and like just this particular type of self promotion that's just like it felt very joyous, and I was like, this is
Yeah.
wonderful. I need to learn more about this person. So thank you so much for spending time with me.
Oh, I'm,
And
I'm happy to do it. It's been a lot of fun. And hopefully answered some questions for some people who wanted them. Thanks for having me.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.